So I wanted to start this video by looking at the patterns of inheritance, how they're different if you are going to be dominant or recessive trait, right? So for example, if you look at something like Huntington's disease, which has basically a dominant trait, or something like achondroplasia or dwarfism, which has dominance, which means that if one of the parents has the disease, so somebody who had Huntington's actually has a child with someone who doesn't have Huntington's, and that, by the way, since you're talking about a dominant trait, would have to be someone like this or like that. We're going to talk about that in a second. But anyways, that first cross here between someone who definitely has Huntington's with someone who doesn't have Huntington's at all, everybody is going to be a hybrid, which all of them are going to have Huntington's. Remember that the disorder is going to be dominant. So that means even if you have only one of the genes to be there, everybody is going to have the disease. In other words, someone who's pure Huntington's, that have two defective Huntington's genes, will always have children that have Huntington's disease. So that's the food for thought, and that's where genetic counseling comes in. Because if you have a child and you only have Huntington's genes, no matter who you marry, you're always going to cause the children to have Huntington's disease. Look at this; it's the same example, but with someone who had Huntington's but was a heterozygous, married a heterozygous person. So let's see there. In this case, obviously the child will have Huntington's because it's an F2 cross. You're going to be half and half like them. But all children will again have Huntington's. So if you are purebred, homozygous dominant Huntington's, you're always going to have children which have Huntington's. Now, if you are heterozygous, it depends on who you cross with. If you cross with a homozygous dominant, of course, you're going to have that. But if you cross with another heterozygous, what's going to happen? That should be an F1 cross, so you should have a 1-to-1 ratio of looking dominant, heterozygous, and then homozygous recessive, or a 3-to-1 ratio in phenotypes, which means you're going to have, in this scenario, 3 out of 1 child is going to have Huntington's, and the other one is not. Or if you're doing this with dwarfism, if 2 dwarfs get married and both of them are heterozygous for dwarfism, they have a 3-to-1 chance to have a dwarf child. That one, obviously, we're going to have dwarf children if they're homozygous dominant for dwarfism. And if you cross someone who's homozygous dominant with someone who's homozygous recessive, or in other words, a pure dwarf with someone who's a taller human, you're going to have all the children be dwarfs as well. So you see how in a dominant disorder, it's more common to have children that share the dominant characteristic than the ones that do not. Now, in this peculiar cross here, it is the only scenario that you would probably get a higher chance of having normal children which don't have Huntington's, because in this scenario you would have basically 2 children which are going to be dominant because they're carrying the dominant gene at least once, but 2 children that, because all they get is the homozygous recessive gene, they're going to be normal. So the best chance for someone who has Huntington's not to have a child with Huntington's is if they actually marry someone that doesn't have it and they themselves are only heterozygous, right? So that's the only way to do it. Basically, this is showing you how the patterns of dominance will create basically more likely for the child to show this disorder, whatever the disorder is. Meanwhile, if this was recessive, let's look at the difference. If this was a recessive disorder, the only children which would have the disease in this setup will be this one and these 2. So it's exactly the opposite. It's much rarer to see the disease show up, right? In the case of recessive traits, say like albinism or something like that. In order for you to be an albino, your parents, each of them, must have had at least 1 recessive gene. So you see that happening here and here. They all have recessive genes, and here as well. Each parent has a recessive gene. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible for you to have a recessive disorder. Which is why recessive disorders show up very rarely when present in the genome. Alright? Now over here you will see that you can demonstrate exactly the same patterns to pedigrees. Remember that what you see here is a male parent that has a disease versus a female that does not have it. And so that immediately takes you about 2 different kinds of parents that could be a P cross, a big A versus a big A little a, versus little a, sorry, big A versus little a, or it could be an F2 cross between a big A versus a little a, either one of those will have parents that look different from each other. So you don't know which one is which. But you know one thing for sure. That cross right there, all the children would automatically look the same because all of the children will be hybrids. Now in this cross here, you have a 50-50 shot of being one of the parents or the other. I see one child on number 3 here, that does not show the disease, so this cannot be the pre-cross. I figured out that this was an F2 cross. You see how you can use genetic patterns to figure this out? All right, so you're doing an F2 cross, and you see that you get these things. Now, notice that 3 out of the children are showing this disease on this cross. Then, now that you know that this child here that shows the disease must be big A, little a, because that's the only way he's going to look dominant. So all of these children are big A, little a, and all of these are big A, little a, which means the other ones must be recessive for both, all right, to not show the trait. So what you're looking at here is what we call dominance pedigree. In a dominance pedigree, you see no skipping of generations, and you see a pattern that matches this kind of setup, where you see F2 crosses and P crosses which follow the laws of dominance, and you see the presence that you're supposed to have. For example, over here you have another F2 cross happening, and therefore you're going to have equal chances of having children of both types. Over here all you have is recessive, so of course all the children are going to be recessive. Over here again you have F2 crosses, and so you have 50-50 shots, and you're going to get either one of the children. So this is a dominance pedigree. Remember how you find a dominance pedigree? You find dominance pedigrees by noticing that you can always, you don't really tend to skip generations. It's very rare to skip generations, and you also see a greater presence of the traits than you would in a pedigree that's recessive. Okay. Now, at the same time, we can also look at the counts of males and females. So let's look at this. We got 1, 2, 3 males that's showing this disease, and 1, 2, 3, 4 females that's showing the disease. I don't see a big difference between males and females, so this shouldn't be sex-linked. I think this is autosomal because it doesn't have a great pattern of difference between males and females. It's another thing that pedigrees can tell you, whether the trait is sex-linked or not. All right, let's look at the second pedigree here. On the second pedigree, we have a trait that suddenly shows up after generations of not being present. How is that possible? How can I have these parents here, which clearly don't show the traits, make a children that shows them up? You should immediately jump in your head. The only time you have parents that look the same, that make children that don't look, that can't make a child that doesn't look like them, is doing an F1 cross, where you have something like big A, little a, times big A, little a. And then it was by joining 1 out of 4 times, this little a's is that where you make something like this. So I know these guys are little a, little a. And so I know this is, immediately, I know this is a recessive trait. And notice the pattern of the recessive trait. How can you tell by looking at the pedigree that it's a recessive pedigree? It skips generations. If it skips a generation, it's automatically a recessive trait. Also, it's very rare to see it on the pedigree chart because it doesn't show up as often when present, right? If this gene is not deleterious, it's going to show up more often. And also, the only possible way, you'll see this as well, when you make 2 parents that look the same, always make children that look the same. So 2 parents that carry the trait have to make children that carry the trait. And so you see that example over there on this pedigree. So that's the basic difference between a dominant versus a recessive pedigree. And this one is also going to be autosomal because, again, if you count the male and the female, you're going to see there's going to be 1, 2 males, 3 males that have it, and maybe for females you're going to have 1, 2. There's not a big difference between males and females, so we're probably talking about an autosomal trait as well, not carried by the sex chromosomes. Now, so what we got here then? This is a different kind of pedigree, which shows us actually shows us, it doesn't hide who the carrier is. And so you know that what you're doing here is an F2 cross between a carrier and a purebred that doesn't have the trait. So I like these because they really make it easier for you by showing you who's carrying and who's not. And so, as usual, on an F2 cross, half and half the children are going to be one way or the other. So you see here 1, 2, 3 children of one type, and then 1 child of the other, and so forth. Now, one thing that's very weird about this particular pedigree, and you should point out here, something that's strange about this pedigree. Now, what do you see here in this particular pedigree? Let's tell the story of this. A carrier mother marries a father that doesn't have the disease. And they have several children, and most of their children do not have the disease, but one son shows it. Then you have 2 daughters which are carriers, both of which marry males which are okay. And then this one daughter here on the right side has 4 daughters that do not have it and 1 son that has it. And then this other couple there has 3 sons, 2 of which have it and 1 which does not. What is exactly happening here? Let's try to decipher this. First of all, remember this is a different kind of pedigree because it's actually showing you the carrier. So sometimes they do that. Sometimes they do the half and half, like I said at the beginning. They show you the carrier. But they're carriers. They're not actually showing the disease. So that means that in this generation, there are no diseased people. And all of a sudden, in this generation, check mark, you got a diseased people. Happens to be a male, by the way. So, what is this? Immediately, it should jump to your head that this is a recessive trait, because a recessive trait skips generations. So we know it's recessive, for sure. But the weird thing about this, if this is a recessive trait, right, that means that having it, you must be little a, right? But if you're little a, wouldn't both be carriers? How could you possibly get a child who's little a, and from a parent that one has a little a, which is carrying it, I can see it, but the other one doesn't? That doesn't make sense. Well, it's because you misunderstood what recessive means. You don't need to be little a to be recessive. You can have just one. Remember, sex linkage. This could be carried by the X chromosome, and then that's why the males are showing it more often than females. Check it out. None of the females actually have it, first of all. All right? The females that have it tend to be carriers rather than actually being diseased. And 4 out of the 7 males in the thing actually have the disease. And many more males than females are having the problem. This is clearly carried by the X chromosome, like we talked about in the sex linkage thing. So this is how a sex linkage pedigree would look like. Remember that if this was showing us if it wasn't showing us the carrier, they would actually have erased those things, and then we wouldn't be able to see what was happening, and it would look something like that, where the carriers would not be available, but you would still be able to guess that it was recessive because of the fact that skipping generations. Notice that in this generation did not have it, and all of a sudden you have it of this generation here, and you can also notice that's recessive and sex-linked because you have more males that having it than females which are having it. That's how you tell something sex-linked. There's a great difference between the female and the male version of that. Meanwhile, something that's like this. Let's try to interpret this one. A male marries a female, and just the male has the disorder, and then they have several children. 2 of the females have it, the female does not have, and then one male does not have it, 1 male has it. And then this couple right here makes a 50-50 child ratio. This couple right here makes no children with it. And these here also make a 50-50 ratio. And this one never had a child, or never married, or died before having a child. Now, first thing that I can point out here, never see a skip of generation. I see an overall pattern of showing in the gene. So it seems to indicate dominance here. I also see there have 4 females with it and 3 males with it. So that doesn't seem to have a pronounced difference between the genders. So I would be able to call this an autosomal dominant trait. That's what we're looking at here, right? So it's an autosomal dominant disease, right? And automatically you know that this person here must be recessive, right? Little a. And this one, can you guess the genotype of that one? Well, think about it. If you're making children, like number 3, which is recessive, that means this guy must have a recessive gene, unless, of course, this is carried by the X chromosome. But if it was, you would see a difference between the genders. So it's not, right? So this would be a heterozygous male, which is creating this 50-50 distribution on the children. And then you can keep going and find out all the genotypes if you want to. In order for this to be like this and have he has to be heterozygous, because that's the only way he's going to look like that. And so will this be, and so will that be, and so forth. And the same story repeats itself over here. These are probably both recessive, and that's why none of the children are recessive, and so forth. You can try to practice and figure out the genotypes of everybody in the pedigree by interpreting the results. Okay? Now here's another one. Another way to see the autosomal recessive pedigree. You see how the trait actually skips a generation, And however, it's autosomal because there is no difference between males and females. There's an equal number of males and females that have the disease. So this is going to be an autosomal recessive, not a sex-linked recessive.